They told you inflation was under control. They showed you the numbers, the official reports, the calm assurances from economists in expensive suits. But somewhere in the fine print between the adjusted metrics and the seasonally corrected data, something massive has been quietly stealing your future. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is mathematics. This is history. And this is the quietest wealth destruction event in modern history, hiding in plain sight inside reports designed to make you believe everything is fine. At first, it happens slowly. You notice the grocery bill climbing a little higher each month. You tell yourself it is just seasonal variation, temporary disruptions. You tell yourself the things economists say on television when they need you to stay calm: keep spending, keep believing. But the bill keeps climbing. And then your landlord tells you next year's lease is going up significantly. And then the price of the car you wanted to buy feels like it belongs to a different economic reality. And then you realize your savings account is earning interest that does not even cover the inflation you are actually experiencing. You are not saving. You are slowly losing ground. And somewhere in the back of your mind, a quiet alarm begins to sound. Not loud enough to cause panic, just loud enough to make you wonder if something fundamental has shifted. Something is being hidden from you, not through grand deception, but through methodology. Through the careful science of measurement that has been quietly redefined over decades to produce results that feel reasonable but are fundamentally misleading. Ray Dalio has spent more than 50 years studying how money works. Not the abstract, theoretical money from economics textbooks, but the real money, the kind that flows through empires and collapses them. His research spans centuries, the entire arc of human economic history, and what he has found is not complicated. It is brutally simple. When debt rises faster than productivity, when money is printed faster than wealth is created, when the gap between what governments promise and what they can actually deliver becomes too large to bridge, the system does not simply adjust. It breaks. And the breaking is always preceded by a period of confusion, where the official numbers say one thing and the lived experience of ordinary people says something entirely different. This is where we are right now, not at the beginning of this story, but somewhere in the middle. The moment where the divergence between reported reality and actual reality has become large enough for those who know how to look to see it clearly, but not yet large enough for everyone else to feel it in a way that cannot be denied. This is the most dangerous phase of any economic transition. The phase where the people who understand what is happening can still position themselves for what comes next, while everyone else remains frozen in false security, trusting numbers carefully constructed to tell them exactly what they want to hear. The history of money is the history of empires. Every major empire in human history has faced the same fundamental challenge. At some point, the cost of maintaining the empire exceeds the productive capacity of the empire. The promises made become larger than the resources available to fulfill them, and the rulers face a choice. They can admit the problem and make the painful adjustments that would restore balance, which means higher taxes or lower spending, which means political suicide in any democracy. Or they can print more money, expand the debt, and buy time. Every empire in history has chosen to buy time, because the alternative requires sacrifice that voters and power structures are never prepared to accept. And so the printing continues, and the debt grows, and the moment of reckoning is pushed further into the future, until the future arrives and there is no future left to push it into. The Roman Empire collapsed not because of a single catastrophic event, but because of decades of currency debasement. The silver content of the denarius fell from nearly pure silver to less than 5% over a few centuries. The government found it easier to reduce the silver content than to raise taxes or cut spending. And for a while, this worked. Prices stayed stable on the surface. Citizens continued to go about their lives. But underneath the surface, the real value of the currency was being destroyed, and the effects rippled through the economy in ways that eventually became impossible to ignore. The late Roman economy was characterized by shortages, by inflation nobody could explain, by a growing divide between those who had access to real resources and those left holding money worth less with each passing year. The historians of the time wrote about the confusion, about the sense that something fundamental had changed but could not be identified. Sound familiar? We are living through the same pattern. And not exactly the same, because no historical parallel is ever exact, but the underlying mechanics are identical. Consider the British Empire and the gold standard. For decades, Britain maintained the pretense that every pound was backed by a fixed amount of gold. But the costs of maintaining global military commitments, of fighting wars, of financing industrialization abroad while maintaining prosperity at home, all required borrowing. When the scale of the debt became too large relative to the actual productive capacity of the empire, the choice was made to abandon the gold standard, to print money, to devalue the currency. The people who held pounds, who had saved their money in British financial instruments, they lost. The people who held gold, real assets, businesses, productive capacity, they survived. The transition took years. The pain was real and deeply traumatic for millions of families who saw their lives dismantled by forces they did not understand. The same pattern repeats across every major economy. Japan in the 1990s, when a real estate bubble collapse revealed decades of hidden debt. Greece in the 2000s, when the true scale of government promises became visible only when the global financial system stopped willing to lend at rates that made the Ponzi scheme sustainable. Argentina, multiple times, each episode following the same arc of borrowing, printing, inflation, default, and the quiet destruction of middle-class security. The people who understand these patterns are not predicting the future with certainty. They are recognizing the present as a variation on a theme that has played out many times before. The official inflation numbers you see every month are constructed using methodologies that have changed significantly over time, often in ways that reduce reported inflation without reducing actual price increases. The basket of goods used to measure inflation has been adjusted, sometimes reasonably, but sometimes in ways that systematically understate the actual cost, increases people experience. The weighting of different categories has been modified to produce lower numbers. The treatment of quality improvements has been refined in ways that reduce reported inflation even when prices have actually risen. Substitution effects allow the basket to shift away from items that rise in price toward items that do not, which sounds logical, but means the reported inflation is based on what people buy when they can no longer afford what they used to buy. The Bureau of Labor Statistics has changed how it calculates inflation dozens of times since the 1980s, and each change produced lower reported numbers. Some economists estimate that if the original methodology from the 1980s were still in use, reported inflation would be between 1% and 3% higher. And this is before we consider housing costs, which have risen dramatically in many regions, but are measured using owner-equivalent rent that moves more slowly than actual market conditions. This creates a strange situation where the economy can be experiencing significant inflation that people feel constantly in their daily lives, while the official numbers suggest inflation is moderate and under control. The two narratives diverge, and this is not a statistical anomaly. It is designed. Because if the true magnitude of the problem were visible in the official numbers, the psychological response would be different. People would demand action, would change their behavior, would stop spending in ways that would cause the recession the official numbers are designed to prevent. And so the numbers tell a story plausible enough to maintain faith in the system, while the system continues to do what it has always done in this situation, which is to transfer wealth from those who hold money to those who control money, from savers to borrowers, from the middle class to the political and financial establishment that benefits from the current arrangement. The inflation that matters most for ordinary people is not the number in the government report. It is the inflation they experience when they try to maintain their standard of living, when they try to save for retirement, when they try to buy a home or send their children to college. The cost of housing has risen faster than official inflation for years. A middle-class family in a major city today spends a much larger share of their income on housing than their parents did a generation ago, leaving less for everything else, requiring both parents to work longer hours just to maintain the same standard of living one income used to provide. The path to homeownership has become prohibitively expensive for a growing segment of the population. The cost of having children, of providing them with education and opportunity, has risen faster than wages in most developed countries. These are not statistical artifacts. They are the lived reality of millions of families who find themselves working harder and falling further behind even as the official numbers suggest everything is under control. What happens next depends on decisions being made right now by people you will never meet, in rooms you will never enter. But the historical pattern is clear. Eventually, the debt reaches a level where the interest payments alone become a significant drain on productive capacity. Central banks face a choice between raising interest rates enough to control inflation, which would trigger a wave of defaults, or keeping rates low enough to prevent the debt service from becoming unsustainable, which allows inflation to continue eroding purchasing power. This is the trap every major civilization has eventually faced. The resolution requires either a painful restructuring, where debts are forgiven and the people who lent money accept losses, or a monetization of the debt, where central banks print money to cover the gap, which causes inflation that erodes the real value of the debt. This is a form of hidden default that falls hardest on those with the least protection, the people whose savings are in cash and fixed income instruments, the retirees who saved their entire lives expecting to live on the interest, the middle-class families who did everything right and are watching their security dissolve in slow motion. This is not theoretical. The German hyperinflation of the 1920s was the logical result of a government that borrowed too much, printed money rather than make painful adjustments. The result was not just economic destruction. It was social and political chaos that eventually reshaped the entire world. Argentina defaulted because the government promised more than it could deliver, and the confidence that held the system together simply evaporated. In every case, the pattern is similar. Debt grows beyond what the system can support. The political system cannot face the pain of correction. Money is printed. Inflation rises. The people who hold the money lose. The people who own the real things, the assets, the businesses, the land, the gold, the skills that cannot be devalued, they survive. And the gap between these two groups widens until the social fabric begins to strain. You have seen this happen in real time. Venezuela, where the official inflation numbers were laughably wrong and the actual experience was hyperinflation that destroyed the savings of an entire generation. Turkey, where the currency lost half its value against the dollar in a single year. Zimbabwe, where inflation reached levels that made the currency essentially worthless, where people were literally richer holding bags of cash than keeping money in bank accounts, where the social order that had existed for generations simply dissolved. The official narrative in each case was that everything was under control right up until the moment when it was not. The breaking point came faster than anyone expected because the nature of these dynamics is that they appear stable right up until the moment when they are not. The system looks solid. The numbers look acceptable. The official statements are reassuring. And then something shifts, some trigger, some loss of confidence that cascades through the system, and the whole edifice begins to crumble. What looked like a stable foundation turns out to have been hollow all along. The dangerous thing about our current situation is not just the scale of the debt, though the scale is historic. It is the complexity of the interconnections, the number of places where the system could break down. The global financial system is built on trust, on the assumption that counterparties will honor their obligations, that markets will remain liquid, that central banks will provide stability. But trust is a fragile thing. It can survive small surprises. It can even survive large ones for a while. But when the surprises keep coming, when the gap between promise and delivery widens beyond a certain point, the trust that holds everything together begins to fray. And when trust breaks, the mathematical relationships that looked so solid suddenly become irrelevant. The numbers on a spreadsheet mean nothing if nobody believes they can be redeemed. And that belief, that fragile psychological foundation on which all monetary systems rest, is the thing quietly eroding. The question is not whether this is happening. The historical record is clear. The pattern is clear. The mathematics are clear. The question is whether you understand it well enough to position yourself for what comes next. Not to profit from catastrophe, not to speculate on collapse, but simply to protect what you have built, to maintain flexibility to adapt, to avoid being among those caught completely off guard when the transition that is already underway accelerates into something that can no longer be denied. The people who understand these dynamics are already adjusting. They are not panic selling. They are quietly rebalancing, diversifying, moving away from assets that look safe but carry hidden risks, toward assets that seem uncertain but have historically preserved value when everything else was falling apart. How does someone prepare for this? Not with specific financial advice, because specific advice is always a function of specific circumstances, but with a fundamental understanding of what is actually happening, of the historical patterns playing out, of the difference between official reality and lived reality that defines this moment. The first step is awareness. The second step is diversification, not just in asset classes, but in thinking and the ability to question conventional wisdom, to consider possibilities others dismiss as improbable. The third step is patience, because these transitions take time, measured in years and decades, not weeks and months. The people who panic and move too quickly often make things worse. The people who ignore the signals and stay locked into old strategies often find themselves unprepared. This is how every major shift begins. Not with an announcement, not with a crash, but with a quiet divergence between what the official numbers say and what people actually experience, with a growing sense that something has changed but cannot quite be identified. The system looks stable. The reports say everything is fine, the experts are reassuring, and underneath the surface, the foundations are shifting. The debt grows, the money printing continues. The hidden inflation compounds in the background, eroding purchasing power, depleting savings, making the eventual correction larger and more painful than it would have been if it had been faced honestly years ago. What happens when this pattern finally breaks? When the choice between continued monetary expansion and honest adjustment can no longer be deferred? The historical answer is that the break is never smooth. The correction is never painless. The restructuring always falls hardest on those least prepared, who trusted the official numbers, who believed the system would continue to function the way it had always functioned. The people who survive these transitions are not necessarily the ones with the most money. They are the ones with the clearest understanding of what is actually happening, with flexibility to adapt, with psychological strength to maintain perspective when everything around them descends into confusion and anxiety. You are being told that everything is under control. You are being shown numbers that suggest inflation is moderate, that the economy is healthy, that the future is roughly similar to the past. But the people who actually understand these dynamics, who have studied them across centuries and civilizations, they see something different. They see the hidden inflation that is not in any government report. They see the debt that has grown beyond what can be sustainably repaid. They see the choices narrowing and the options becoming more painful with each passing year. And they are positioning themselves accordingly, not because they want a profit from collapse, but because they understand that the transfer of wealth already underway will accelerate, and that those on the wrong side of that transfer will find it increasingly difficult to recover what they have lost. Something massive is happening. Most people still do not see it, but now you do, and what you do with that knowledge will determine everything.